In 1972, Chrysler Australia built what many consider the greatest six-cylinder performance engine this country has ever produced, the 265 HEMI Six, 302 horsepower, triple Weber carburetors, 149 examples built, and then nothing. No evolution, no development, no follow-up that was faster, more powerful, or more advanced. Instead, what came next was weaker, slower, strangled by detuning that turned one of Australia's most celebrated engines into a shadow of what it had been. So, what happened? Politicians didn't pass a law. They didn't need to. A campaign of public pressure, media panic, and insurance threats did something far more effective. It convinced the manufacturers to kill their own performance programs before the government had to step in. This is the story of the Supercar Scare and how political pressure silenced the 265 HEMI Six. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what Chrysler Australia achieved in the first place. The 265 cubic inch HEMI Six wasn't born in 1972. It had been part of Chrysler's Australian engine lineup since 1970, fitted to the V8 Valiant Charger in various states of tune. In standard form, powering the Charger 770, it produced around 203 horsepower, respectable for a six-cylinder, but nothing that would rewrite the rule book. The engine's defining characteristic was right there in the name: hemispherical combustion chambers, the same principle Chrysler's American parent company used in their legendary HEMI V8s, but adapted to an inline six-cylinder configuration. Better breathing, more efficient combustion, and a design that rewarded high revving performance. By 1971, Chrysler Australia's competition department had begun developing a version of the 265 specifically for Group C touring car racing. To race it, they needed to homologate it, which meant building a minimum number of road-going examples with the competition specification intact. That car became the E38 Charger. The E38 still displaced 265 cubic inches, still used the same basic block as the standard Charger, but now it breathed through 3 twin-choke Weber carburetors, featured a competition-spec cylinder head with larger valves and improved porting, and was fitted with a camshaft profile chosen for top-end power rather than street manners. The result: 302 horsepower at 6,000 revolutions per minute. For context, that was the same power output Holden claimed for their 5.7-liter Monaro GTS 350 V8, the same figure Ford quoted for their Falcon GTHO Phase 3 with its 351 cubic inch V8. Chrysler had matched the V8s with a six-cylinder engine displacing just 4.3 liters. Period road tests of the E38 recorded quarter-mile times in the mid-14-second range. That's genuinely quick for 1971. 0 to 60 miles per hour came up in the mid-6-second range, depending on conditions and driver skill. These were numbers that put it firmly in the conversation with Australia's fastest production cars. But Chrysler wasn't finished. In 1972, they refined the formula further with the E49. The E49 represented the absolute peak of what Chrysler Australia achieved with the 265 HEMI, and it arrived at precisely the wrong moment in Australian automotive history, because while Chrysler's engineers were perfecting a six-cylinder performance engine, forces were gathering in Canberra and in the media that would make 1972 the last year this kind of car could exist. The E49 Charger, released in 1972, was not radically different from the E38 on paper. Same 265 cubic inch displacement, same triple Weber carburation, same claimed 302 horsepower, but the details mattered. The cylinder head had been further refined based on racing experience. The camshaft profile was more aggressive. The exhaust system was tuned for top-end performance. The suspension was firmed up, the brakes upgraded. Everything about the E49 suggested a car that had been honed through competition and then made available to the public. Only 149 were built. These weren't mass-market vehicles. At over $5,000, the E49 was the most expensive Valiant Chrysler Australia had ever offered. You could buy a well-equipped Monaro GTS for less. But for those who wanted the fastest six-cylinder production car Australia had ever built, there was no substitute. Contemporary magazine tests recorded standing quarter-mile times in the low to mid 14-second range, with some variations depending on conditions and driver technique. 0 to 60 came up in roughly 6.3 to 6.5 seconds in most published tests, numbers that placed it among the quickest Australian cars of the era. More importantly, the E49 could be ordered through a Chrysler dealership, registered for the road, and driven legally. It wasn't a race car pretending to be street legal. It was a genuine production vehicle that happened to be extraordinarily quick. Chrysler's engineers believed they could push it further. Rumors circulated within the competition department about plans for even hotter variants, improved cylinder heads, revised intake systems, and weight reduction programs. Whether those plans were formal development programs or workshop speculation is difficult to verify decades later. But the belief existed that the 265 HEMI was nowhere near its limit. That belief would never be tested, because by late 1972, the conversation in Australia had shifted away from how fast these cars could go to whether they should exist at all. The term that entered the Australian vocabulary in late 1972 was supercar, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. Media outlets began running stories about young drivers killed in high-powered vehicles. Insurance companies made noise about skyrocketing premiums, and politicians, sensing an issue that could play well with concerned parents and safety advocates, began applying pressure. No law was passed, but what happened next was perhaps more effective than legislation could ever have been. Peter Nixon, the federal minister for shipping and transport, made it clear in public statements throughout late 1972 that the government was watching. His message was simple: the manufacturers could regulate themselves, or the government would do it for them. Insurance companies reinforced the pressure. Premiums on high-performance cars were climbing. The media amplified every accident involving a powerful vehicle, running headlines about supercar deaths. Whether the statistics supported a crisis is debatable. Road fatalities were climbing for reasons unrelated to performance cars. But statistics don't matter when the narrative has taken hold. Ford canceled the XA Falcon GTHO Phase 4 before it reached production. Holden shelved development of hotter Torana variants, and Chrysler looked at the 149 E49 Chargers they'd just sold and made a decision. There would be no further development of the 265 HEMI as a performance engine. When the E55 badge eventually appeared on later Chargers, it produced around 248 horsepower, a significant step backward from the E49's 302. Compression ratios lowered, carburation simplified. The engine was being detuned to demonstrate that Chrysler was being responsible. No formal law had been passed, but the effect was the same. The political and commercial pressure convinced three major manufacturers to simultaneously abandon performance development. The Supercar Scare worked, and the 265 HEMI would never be pushed beyond its 1972 peak. So, what could the 265 HEMI have become if the political climate had been different? We can't point to documented engineering plans or preserved prototype parts to answer that question, but we can look at what happened in other markets where performance development continued. While Australia's muscle car era ended in 1973, America's simply adapted. Emissions regulations arrived in the United States as well. Insurance companies there also raised premiums on high-performance vehicles. The early to mid-1970s saw power outputs drop across the board as manufacturers struggled to meet new requirements. But American development didn't stop. It adapted. engineers learned to work within the new constraints. Electronic fuel injection eventually replaced carburetors. Turbocharging and supercharging compensated for lower compression ratios. Computer engine management systems optimized performance within regulatory limits. By the 1980s and 1990s, American V8s were making more power than their early 1970s muscle car predecessors while running cleaner and more efficiently. The technology evolved because the manufacturers were allowed and even encouraged to keep developing it. Australia took a different path. The Supercar Scare didn't just pause performance development, it effectively killed it. When manufacturers eventually returned to building quick cars in Australia, they were often doing so with imported engines or powertrains developed overseas. The institutional knowledge that had produced engines like the 265 HEMI, the Holden 308, and Ford's Cleveland engines gradually dissipated. Could the 265 HEMI have evolved? Almost certainly. Fuel injection technology existed. Aluminium components could have reduced weight. Electronic engine management could have improved drivability while maintaining performance. These weren't science fiction concepts in the mid-1970s. They were simply technologies that required continued investment and development. But that investment never came. The 265 HEMI continued to appear in Chargers through the rest of the 1970s, but each iteration was a little less special than the one before. Compression dropped, power outputs declined. By the time Chrysler Australia's operations began winding down in the early 1980s, the 265 was a relic of an earlier era rather than a foundation for future development. The engineers who'd developed it moved on to other projects or left the industry. The expertise was never passed to a next generation because there was no next generation of Australian performance engine development to pass it to. Here's what makes the Supercar Scare particularly frustrating when viewed with decades of hindsight. It didn't actually solve the problem it claimed to address. Road fatalities in Australia continued climbing through the mid-1970s despite the end of supercar production. The E49 Chargers that had sparked so much concern. Most were bought by collectors or enthusiasts who treated them carefully. They were too expensive to be common, too rare to be reckless with. The real progress on road safety came from mandatory seatbelt laws, random breath testing, improved road infrastructure, and better driver education, none of which had anything to do with horsepower figures. The Supercar Scare was political theatre that felt productive but achieved little beyond ending a chapter of Australian automotive history that didn't need to end when it did. Today, the E49 Charger is one of the most valuable Australian production car ever built. Auction results over the past decade show authenticated examples selling for between $500,000 and $600,000, with exceptional examples occasionally exceeding that range. Most of the 149 built are accounted for by collectors and historians. They're treated as cultural artifacts, reminders of a brief moment when Australian manufacturers were building genuinely world-class performance cars. But here's the question that sits at the heart of this story. What would those 149 cars represent if development had continued? If the E49 had been followed by progressively more refined, more advanced iterations rather than by detuned retreats? We'll never know. Because in 1972 and 1973, a combination of media panic, political pressure, and industry self-censorship closed a door that didn't need to be closed. The 265 HEMI Six reached its peak and was immediately forced into decline. Not because the engineers couldn't push it further, not because buyers didn't want it, but because the political climate made continued development commercially and politically unviable. The The 265 HEMI Six didn't fail on its technical merits. It didn't lose in the marketplace. It was silenced by forces that had nothing to do with engineering excellence and everything to do with public perception and political calculation. That's the real cost of the Supercar Scare. Not the 149 E49s that were built, but the hundreds of progressively better successors that never got the chance to exist. Want more stories about the engines and cars that defined Australian automotive history and the forces that ended it prematurely? Subscribe if you want, because this isn't the only engine that deserved better. Until then, remember the E49, remember what it was, and remember what it could have been.